Welcome to Books in the World, a production of the Cape Cod Writers Center that was established 57 years ago. Books in the World has been broadcasting continuously for 41 years, and we strive to interview published authors who have made an impact on the world with their books and essentially look into how they have done so. I'm Jonathan Ryder, and it is my pleasure to welcome Michael Solomowitz, author of his debut novel, Behind the Fourth Wall. Thank you so much for joining us, Michael.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Behind the Fourth Wall follows the story of Noah Miller, who is a playwright and dissatisfied theater critic from New York. He has a friend that actually gives him a ability to produce a play in none other than Cape Cod, specifically at the Cape Playhouse. So the world of Cape Cod is definitely unfolded thoroughly in this book, and he goes through a very strong transformation because he's dealing with the loss of his wife and his young daughter. And it deals a lot with his struggles through that and eventually coming out the other end through therapeutic means and also the help of his friends. Now, Michael has been working with a wide array of different writing fields, from journalism to playwriting, which is very apt for this book, as has already been noticed. He has written scripts for Manhattan Cable TV and has worked with Warner Brothers and Hollywood. In addition to years of freelance sports writing, he has also published many articles nationally. Add to that being an active writer and director of numerous plays from California to Long Island, and you have a well-rounded writer who has definitely devoted their share to the craft. Now, one of my first questions is, it is often said that the author's debut novel is almost an autobiography of themselves in many ways. Seeing as your main character, Noah, is also a playwright and also very intimately deals with the New York scene, as you do, and also Cape Cod, I think that's not too far off from that. With that said, Noah expresses early in the novel a dismal view of the New York play scene and creative endeavors as a whole throughout the story. Is that something you share?
Well, you write from what you know, right? I wouldn't say I have a dismal vision of the New York play scene, maybe Broadway in particular, because I think Broadway has evolved. It caters to the tourists, which is understandable. I understand supply and demand, but you know, the price of a ticket on Broadway has really gone through the roof. And with so much theater available, off-Broadway theater and community theater and regional theater, there are so many other choices. You don't have to really go to Broadway to see a play anymore. So, is Noah down on Broadway? Yes, to some extent. He is a theater critic, and he's writing about the industry. But Broadway in particular is really what I was trying to say there.
Excellent. And I definitely can see that. Being a little bit associated with theater myself, I feel that it's best that the general populace can appreciate and enjoy it, and Broadway does alienate that, I find, a lot. So with that said, actually, because Cape Cod is such a theatrical place and culturally rich, it is almost character in your story. And many of the locations that are seen, the Heritage Museum, and a wide array of restaurants, which are often featured in the story, it definitely gives such a rich kind of environment and details. So what kind of research did you do? Seeing as you are pretty much a local here, I imagine there was a little bit more that went into developing and fleshing that out.
Yeah, well, we enjoy eating at an array of different restaurants on Cape Cod, and I really wanted, Cape Cod is like another player in the book, and I wanted the reader to understand how much I love Cape Cod and enjoy it, and so every place that I mention in the book is real, is nonfiction. I name places, different restaurants, and the Heritage you mentioned. There was one restaurant that I made up, actually. I wanted to see if anyone noticed it or asked me about it. So far, not. But between the hiking in Eastham and the Nauset Trail and the Scargo and the Playhouse. There's just so much, and the restaurants and the theater. There's just so much to do here and to love about Cape Cod. So yes, it is sort of like another player in the book.
Excellent. Yeah, I know that there was a scene in Provincetown that's particularly striking, and the details that are captured are very haunting in a way. Now, on the note of doing a little bit of research, with the Cape Playhouse, this is where a lot of the story takes place and a lot of the core of the transformation occurs. Can you tell me any details you went into for the history or researching a little further into that?
Yeah, I mean, with online, and I went on the website, I got a real sense of the history of the Playhouse and when it was created. And I think it was a meeting house back in the 19th century, and it moved, and all the wonderful actors from the 20s and 30s and 40s that came out from New York City to perform on the stage. It's a rich history. It's a beautiful history. There's so much to the Playhouse. I also remember sitting in the audience for a play that we saw there and just taking notes of the structure so that I was able to describe what it actually, the physical sense of it. And there was also a book on the theater of Cape Cod, which was helpful, and a couple other research books that I used to really get a good flavor for the Playhouse and what occurred there.
Excellent. Yeah, I know particularly when you were talking about the rafters, the specific details you used resonated a lot with me, because I had actually had the benefit of working there before. So I was like, oh yeah, he definitely knows what he's talking about when you mentioned that. So it was definitely very enjoyable to see those details gone into. On the same idea, the Cape Cod theater scene is a very unique one as it is, and you do depict the actors who audition and eventually act out the performance for Noah. Now, did you do any specific research for that, or was there anything in particular you went into for it?
Well, as far as research goes, I've been in theater for many years. I've had several plays produced, and I've worked in other respects on theater. So it was really drawing from my experience, and I'm glad I had enough to know about what I was writing about. At least I think I did, and it was a fun trip to take.
Mm-hmm. And I think obviously being a playwright / director, that definitely lended itself quite well to that, and those little details were very noticeable, having experienced theater in a variety of different ways. Now, one aspect on that note that I really enjoyed was the amount of detail you went into with the process from a play being written and being fully produced, and all the follies and foibles that come along with it, including dealing with egocentric people like a character Peter that gets in Noah's way quite substantially in a very annoying way that's very realistic. Now, you did a great job to make that come alive to the reader. What I wonder, though, was it difficult matching the pacing of the story with going into that much detail to make that very, very realistic and true?
Pacing is a difficult thing, because you never know, are you giving away too much too early, or did you leave something out that you forgot to tell the reader that's not going to make any sense if you don't put it back in? So pacing is a definite issue when you're writing a book, because it's a long piece. It's not an essay or a short story. So there's a lot to think about over the course of writing a book. As far as Peter and personalities, so there was conflict there, and then something happens that changes the whole course of the story. So there's a lot to think about when you're writing a book, and I really wanted the reader to see what goes on behind the curtain at the rehearsals and at the meetings, because there's a lot that goes on putting a play on stage, and I wanted the reader to be right there listening, and for the audition process and the rehearsal process, and what does the director say to actors. And I think that's what you get. I hope that's what you get from reading the book.
Yeah, I definitely enjoyed those small little details, because the average person sees a performance that's an hour and a half, 2 hours, and they just enjoy it. They see what's great, they see what they don't like, but they don't see how much tireless time goes into it for everyone involved, be it sound, actors, or the director themselves. On that note, aside from being obviously a playwright and director, are there any other elements that you've personally worked with in the theater?
I've run the gamut, although I've never really done sound, but I was a camera operator in a real theater, in a TV theater. But as far as stage theater goes, I've been a director, an assistant director, a production manager. I've produced children's theater for a few years, which was fun, and then writing the plays and directing the plays. I pretty much covered most of it, I think, and I thought I had enough experience and knowledge to be able to write the different aspects of this book.
Definitely. I think those all those details come alive, and even though you might not cover the sound or the lighting or the camera operating in this case, it does really enrich the experience because it does show that the author knows more than necessarily the main character. And on which note, Noah is a very complicated character. He has a lot going. He's obviously suffering from post-traumatic stress and a lot of deep-seated issues that he's constantly trying to fight through. Now, at times he even becomes so self-focused and almost unlikable because of his passivity, but it makes it realistic. And that's something I always really appreciated. Now, did his character design kind of come out from the beginning, or was it something that kind of steadily evolved as you were writing the story?
Well, it definitely evolved. I needed to start somewhere dark, I thought. That's where I really decided to start. Noah's in a dark place. He's lost his family. His boss is on his back because he's being very negative with his theater reviews. So he's in a sort of a dark place to begin with. When I thought about it, I realized that I started writing notes for the book probably in 2018, which was when my mom had passed away. My mom, thank God, lived to be 100 years old. Wonderful, wonderful long life. And so I think some of the grief started with that, with the mourning period. And there I had the beginning of, using it to help with the pain. I was able to write about it. And so that's where Noah starts at the beginning of the book. And then there is a whole evolution of where he goes to get to the end of the book. And it was, so in a way, it was cathartic for me, in a way, at least the beginning process of getting into the character from where he started, from that dark place.
Definitely, and that transformative kind of journey, almost the hero's journey, as it will, definitely came through, especially. And because of him being almost unlikable to start, it made you kind of start rooting for him when he started doing things that were more positive and more in the right direction of his growth.
Yeah, that's a good point. He needs to be liked, really, because he is the protagonist of the book. I mean, I wanted him to be a likable character. And I think if there were any flaws in him, I mean, he was in a rough place. He may have been self-centered, but he was coming from a dark place where he was, it was about him a lot in, trying to deal with his pain and the loss of his family. So there's quite an evolution, I think, of his character from where he begins and where he ends.
Without a doubt, definitely. And going into those nitty-gritty elements of almost making him unlikable, but making him realistic, made it much more likable in the end, where you really do root for him, you really do care that he's really come out the other end in a better place. Now, from a stylistic standpoint, the chapters go through an interesting dynamic in which you choose to change from the third-person perspective to first person, which I found that interesting, a little bit jarring at first, but I started kind of gathering where you were going with it. But please tell me a little bit more of what your kind of aims were for doing that.
So the book is basically written in third person, but I needed to include some backstory. And so I chose to use first person so that you can see what he was going through, his past, through his eyes. And you were right up front row, right there with him when he learned about his daughter's death, or he was in the room when he found his wife. And so I used first person basically for backstory, and I thought it may have been jarring a bit, but I thought it worked well for those chapters.
Yeah, I found it actually did. As I said, at first it was a little strange to get used to, but obviously the alternatives are you can do it through exposition, you can do it through flashbacks, you can do it through dialogue, but sometimes that can feel heavy-handed, and also with such trauma that he goes through, it is definitely a difficult thing to communicate through those mediums. So I did feel that the first-person perspective did kind of ring true to like making him come alive and making his backstory come alive. So I did really appreciate that. Also, another thing I found interesting is throughout the book was something I did not expect because it was a play about a New York, pretty much theater critic that comes to Cape Cod to produce his play. But then there's an element of the Native Americans that come into it, which there's flashes of almost awakened dreams that he goes through, and actual dreams, but they're all very prophetic and mold his character in a way that almost supernatural elements seem to slip into the book, which was surprising. So tell us more of like why you chose to include that.
There's a whole history, hundreds of years of history involved with the Native Americans and our area. So I thought, again, layering the book with a little bit of a history of Cape Cod and where it's come from, and I just thought it was, and then I needed a way to really connect it to Noah. So I have his wife is actually Native American, and there's a whole other story about that, and her great aunt, which we won't get into. But so there was a way to connect it to Noah. There was a way to talk about the history of Cape Cod and the Native Americans, and I just thought it was interesting to be able to layer it on to the whole Cape Cod scene.
Definitely, and as you said, another story. It definitely felt like there was almost an underlying story that was going on, especially with I think even at one point Noah's qualified as the chosen, and that gives a very interesting element that I wanted to find more about, but there really wasn't anything to it. So is there actually a follow-up to that? Is there a possible book in the works of you exploring that more?
Not at this time. I am working on another novel. I don't know if you want to get into that now or not.
We can save that for a little near the end.
All right, but right now, no. There's no other.
Excellent. All right.
Book two.
That's great. Well, on the note of creative processes and putting a play to life, Committed is the play that Noah Miller produces at the Cave Playhouse, and it's interesting because a lot of what happens in Committed reflects what happened in his life. In fact, one of the main characters goes through a traumatic thing in which she's cheated on and essentially is kind of spurned but still loves the person. And the ironic thing is Noah's character is who that happened to. So he switched the genders of it because he felt that it made it easier to write that way, which has always been something as a writer, it kind of stings out of like, oh, that's not the right path to go, because you always want to write the hard stuff. That's how you make a good story. So please talk a little bit more on that and whether you saw that as a flaw of Noah's or whether it was something for him to confront and deal with.
I think it was a flaw to some extent. So you're right about that. Noah had a couple of deep relationships in his life earlier on before he met his wife. And so that's what is the breakup of those two relationships, while, as you said, while they were on the end of, the women broke up with him for specific reasons, it was painful for him. And so when they're sitting around on July 4th on the beach in front of the fire and they're discussing Committed and the background, and he says that, it was just easier to write that way. I never really thought about it until you mentioned it to me. And it was sort of a throwaway line, but when I started thinking about it, he didn't want to deal with the pain, really. So he did turn the table in that sense. It was hard. I mean, it really was hard for him to deal with being rejected. So what he did was, when he wrote Committed, he turned the table, and now he's the one who can't commit, who can't give his relationship what she's asking for. So in a way, I kind of turned the table, but he was still able to use the pain of the breakup in the same way. It was just a different character.
Definitely. I mean, you touch upon something that's really always been powerful with writing. It is therapeutic in a way. Whether you intend it to be or not, it always comes through and you're dealing with some of your own issues or some of your own questions of like, what if I'd gone down that path? Or what if in that relationship I'd explored that? So I did find that a very interesting element that was kind of throughout, especially with specifically Noah's interactions with Molly, which is a very interesting and slightly contentious relationship on the surface, who she actually serves as the main character in Committed. So with that actually, can you tell us more about like why you chose to have the romantic interest be actual Molly, who's in a situation he could possibly lose his job and she could kind of be blacklisted?
That's true. I mean, especially in these times.
Right.
Luckily, I wrote this a couple of years ago before the whole mess got in the way. But I wanted to have a love story in the book, aside from his relationship with his wife, which we see bits and pieces of because that's more in that first person, exposition, past tense. So I wanted him to have a love interest, and yeah, it was. They were worried. They discuss it about what would happen if people found out. So they try to keep it a secret. Luckily, the producer of the show is a good friend of his, so even though he knew about the relationship, but it didn't really get in the way. I think it really helps tell the story and helps him find a way out of his depression and a way to, and a future, and we won't go into what happens at the end, but there's a sense of, it wasn't tied up in a ribbon, but there's a feeling of, it's going to get better for Noah.
Very much so. Yeah. And I think having, again, once more, that gritty detail of the realism element is these things do happen. And with the profound trauma that Noah goes through, like, he does need every ally possible. And you have, obviously, Molly, obviously, Jerry, his good friend that got him this ability and this chance to pretty much expand and go forward in his life. And you even have his wife's best friend, Dee Dee, who makes an appearance a number of times. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really powerful concept in that, right? In the fact of anyone who does go through trauma, and especially something this bad, you need people around you, and you need to kind of make those connections. That's kind of what it's all about with living in general. So, right. Now on the note of Committed, before we get too far away, do you have any interest, being a playwright and all, of ever producing that into an actual play? Because it did have a lot of fun elements I liked.
So there's a very funny story about this. It was a play. It was an early play that I wrote, a full-length play, way back, and I wrote the play, enjoyed writing it. I couldn't come up with the ending, so I just put in an ending, and not the best ending. Let's just leave it at that. At the time, I was involved with a theater group. This is when I was living out in L.A., and one of the actors who I knew asked me if I had a play that his other theater group could read, because they were always looking for plays. And I had just finished, I guess, Committed, and without thinking, gave him the play. Didn't think about it. We go ahead about 2 or 3 years later. I got married. My wife and I are going cross country. We're moving back to New York. A month before we leave, I get a call from, on our a theater artistic director, and she says, "Hi, I'm so-and-so, I work here and here, and we're going to be doing a stage reading of your play Committed." And I'm like, "How did you get my play? I mean, that's been sitting in a drawer for 3 years." I completely forgot I had given it to this actor. So she invites me to come down with my family and my friends on this night to the theater, and we go down that night, and it's just a few weeks before we left LA. And they do the stage reading up on stage. And as I'm watching the play, of course, I start thinking about the ending. I never fixed that, did I? That's a problem. So they finish the play, and she comes out on stage, and she thanks me, and she thanks everybody for coming, and she says, "Now we're going to have a question and answer session with the playwright." And I'm like, okay, this is not good. And I'm thinking, all right, maybe they didn't notice the ending. I go up, I sit down, I have stage fright as it is, but I'm sitting on stage in front of everybody. And the first question they say, "So tell us about the ending." And so that's as far as the play went. It had a stage reading. I never fixed the ending. But I was able to use bits and pieces of the good scenes in the book. So there are some funny scenes, some touching scenes that all worked. I just left the ending out of the book so that you never really get to see that.
Excellent. Yeah, and I remember a specific scene where you have like almost a game show going on where you're a schmuck Chuck.
Yes.
And
yes.
I found that very particularly interesting, especially with one theatrically how to put it on, which I found interesting and a little
was
difficult.
a fun scene to write.
But yeah, I'm sure it was. So on that note, what other projects are you working on currently?
I am currently working on my next novel. It is historical fiction. It takes place in post-World War II Coney Island, which is where I grew up. I'm still writing from what I know. And it's about a family and the breakdown of a family. And I don't have a title yet. I call it Coney Island, but that won't be the title. And it's the breakdown of a family, and really, but it's a coming-of-age story of a young teenager and losing his father, not in death, but in another way, and what he goes through dealing with that. And then the story jumps ahead 15 years later, and now we see him as a grown-up. So I'm enjoying writing that, and that's my new novel.
Excellent.
The other thing I'm doing is I've written some of the plays I've written that were performed on Long Island. I've been given an evening of my comedies, so I'm having 4 plays produced, 4 one-act plays produced. It's called Divine Comedy. It's going to be next June at the Curtain Call Theater in Braintree, which is just outside of Boston. And I'm going to direct 2 of them. I'm going to get another director for the other 2, and I'm really looking forward to that.
Terrific. Well, we could definitely talk a lot further on these details and further elements of those, but unfortunately we've run out of time. Michael, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jonathan.
And thank you everyone for joining us on Books in the World. I've been Jonathan Ryder. And remember, like, subscribe, make sure to get this out there, and make sure to pick up Behind the Fourth Wall if you love theater, or if you love Cape Cod, or if you just love a good book. Thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you soon.